The ceremony was already underway when Oliver leaned over to whisper something into Cassandra's ear, and she laughed. That soft, private laugh that I had spent 3 years believing was only for me. I was standing at the altar in a gown that cost more than most people's first cars. My father had insisted on it. A Vera Wang from the Toronto boutique on Bloor Street, fitted 3 times over 6 months, the kind of dress you only wear once and keep forever. I had felt beautiful in it, I had felt chosen, and then I looked at my groom and I understood. Oliver wasn't nervous. He had the expression of a man who had already made his decision. Calm, almost relieved. He turned to me slowly, in front of 200 guests at the estates of Sunnybrook, in front of my colleagues and his family and the officiant who had spent 40 minutes going over the ceremony with us the night before. And he said, "I'm sorry, Helen." Almost kindly. Cassandra was watching from the second row, and she wasn't surprised. I want to tell you that I cried, that I screamed, that I threw the bouquet of white peonies at his face and made a scene that people would talk about for years. But the truth is, I felt something go very still inside me, the way a lake goes still just before a storm, and I thought, okay, now I know. I handed my bouquet to my maid of honor, Tara, whose face had gone white. I said, "Give me a minute." I walked to the back of the hall, through the side corridor that smelled like lilies and catering warmers, and I sat down on a chair near the coat check and I breathed. No one followed me. Oliver certainly didn't. I heard the murmur of the crowd shifting. I heard someone, his mother Elaine, say something sharp to the officiant. I heard Cassandra's heels on the marble floor, moving toward the altar where I had just been standing. I took off my veil. I folded it over my arm. And then I walked out the service entrance, onto a side street in Leaside, and called a cab, because my phone still worked and my legs still worked. And whatever else Oliver had taken from me in the past 30 seconds, he hadn't taken those. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I did not let them see me cry until I was in the back of that cab, heading west on Eglinton with the window cracked, and even then I kept it quiet. The driver, bless him, turned up the radio. What Oliver did not know, what no one at that wedding knew, except my father and our family's legal team, was that 3 weeks before the ceremony, I had received a letter from my father's estate solicitor, informing me that the trusteeship of my grandfather's holding company, Sterling North Capital, was formally being transferred to me on my 35th birthday, which was 4 months away. Sterling North Capital managed just over $2.4 billion in assets across Western Canada and Ontario. My father, Gordon, had built it from a regional Alberta oil servicing company into a diversified investment portfolio spanning real estate, private equity, and clean energy infrastructure. He was not famous in the way that tech founders are famous. He was the kind of rich that doesn't need to be famous, the kind that shows up in filings and boardroom conversations, not on magazine covers. I had grown up in Edmonton in a house that was large but not ostentatious, driven to school in a Volvo, attended the University of Alberta on a full academic scholarship that I applied for myself because my father wanted me to understand the value of earning things. I had my own career, my own apartment in Toronto's Roncesvalles neighborhood, my own salary as a corporate communications director at a mid-size asset management firm. Oliver knew I was comfortable. He did not know what comfortable meant in my case. I had chosen not to tell him. Not out of deception. Or at least, not at first. At the beginning, it was simpler than that. I was tired of being looked at differently once people found out. I was tired of the particular way men's eyes changed, the subtle recalculation that happened behind their face. I wanted to be wanted for the version of me that took the subway and argued about restaurant bills and stayed up late like someone who bought performance reviews. Oliver had seemed like someone who wanted exactly that. He was a civil engineer with a good salary and a condo in Liberty Village and strong opinions about where to eat brunch. He made me laugh. He remembered small things. On our second anniversary, he had framed a photograph of the trail at Rattlesnake Point, where we had hiked on our first date, and I had thought, this is a person who pays attention. I was wrong, or rather, I was right about who he had been, and wrong about whether he had stayed that way. Cassandra worked at his firm. She had been introduced to me at a company party in the fall, nearly a year before the wedding. I had liked her immediately, which embarrasses me to remember now. She was sharp and funny and wore a burnt orange blazer I had complimented. She and Oliver had seemed like colleagues who ribbed each other about deadlines. Nothing more. I went back to my apartment that night after the wedding and I sat on my kitchen floor in the Vera Wang gown, and I went through everything. Every dinner he'd canceled, every weekend trip that had become shorter than planned, every time he had been on his phone in another room. It was all there. I had simply chosen not to see it. The way you choose not to see the first crack in a wall, because you've just finished painting the room. My phone had 57 notifications. I turned it face down and poured myself a glass of Shiraz and started making a list. Not of grievances, of decisions. The next morning, I called my father. Gordon is not an emotional man. He is quiet and precise, and he communicates affection through action. Showing up, solving problems, asking the right questions. When I told him what had happened, he was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Are you hurt?" "Yes," I said. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Okay," he said. "What do you need?" I told him I needed to take a leave of absence from my job, and that I wanted to come to Edmonton for a few weeks, and that when I came back I was going to do things differently. He asked what differently meant. I told him I was ready to step into the company's work more formally, earlier than planned, if he was open to it. There was another pause. "I've been waiting for you to say that for about 4 years." He said. "I spent 6 weeks in Edmonton. I met with our legal team and our CFO and the heads of our 3 primary portfolio divisions. I read documents I had been avoiding for years, not because I didn't care about the company, but because I had been careful to build a life that was mine and not simply inherited. Now I began to understand that the two things were not incompatible. I could be both. I could be the woman from Roncesvalles who made her own coffee and took the subway, and I could also be the person who, on her 35th birthday, would become the controlling trustee of one of the largest family-owned investment portfolios in the country. I came back to Toronto in October. Oliver had texted me 17 times over the 6 weeks. The first 3 were apologies, careful and formal, the kind that are really explanations. After that, they tapered. A check-in, a question about a shared streaming subscription, and eventually silence. He and Cassandra were, according to Tara, who had heard from a mutual friend, officially together. I moved into a larger apartment, a rental in Forest Hill, because my lease in Roncesvalles had ended anyway, and I needed room for the work I was beginning to bring home. I bought decent furniture, and a proper coffee setup and a desk that faced the window. I also signed a consulting contract with Sterling North Capital as a communications and public relations advisor, at a salary that reflected the seniority of the role. My name was not on any public-facing material yet. My father and I had agreed that we would manage the transition quietly, over the course of the year before my birthday, before any formal announcement. The Toronto financial community is smaller than people think, especially at the level my family operated in. I began attending dinners, sitting on a panel at a private equity conference at the Shangri-La, joining a small advisory board for a clean energy startup we had invested in. I was introduced, consistently, as a communications executive with a background in asset management, which was accurate, and also incomplete in ways that I allowed to remain unaddressed. I ran into Oliver for the first time in early November, at a charity gala at the Art Gallery of Ontario. The kind of event where the ticket price is not printed anywhere because if you need to ask, you haven't been invited correctly. He saw me across the room before I saw him. I could tell because when I turned, his face had already cycled through an expression I couldn't quite identify. Surprise, then something more complicated, and by the time I looked directly at him, he had arranged himself into something like composure. Cassandra was beside him, in a midnight blue dress, holding a glass of white wine. She looked at me, and then looked away. I was with my father's CFO, Walter, and a woman named Diane from our real estate division, and the CEO of one of our portfolio companies, a man who had recently been profiled in the Globe and Mail. We were in the middle of a conversation about a commercial development project in Waterloo. I returned to the conversation. Oliver made his way over about 20 minutes later. "Helen," he said. "Oliver," I said, "good to see you." It wasn't, but I was raised well. He said something about not knowing I would be here, asked how I was, made the small performative gestures of a person trying to indicate that things between us were resolved and ordinary. I answered in the appropriate register. I was busy, settling into some new work. He asked what kind of work. "Investment advisories," I said. "Family business." I watched something shift in his face, but he nodded as though that were a normal thing I might have always said, and excused himself. Walter, who had known my family for 20 years, waited until Oliver was gone, and then looked at me with the particular expression he reserved for deals that had just revealed their real structure. He said nothing. I said nothing. We went back to talking about Waterloo. In December, my father flew to Toronto for a board dinner at Canoe. The restaurant on the 54th floor of the TD Bank Tower. The kind of place people go when the number they're discussing has many zeros. He introduced me, formally, to 3 people I had spoken to before only in writing. The managing director of a private bank, a senior partner at a pension fund, and a real estate developer, whose name appeared on buildings I walked past every week. Each of them knew who my father was. Now they were learning, or confirming, who I was. I came home that night and stood in my kitchen and felt something clarify inside me, the way a winter sky clears after a long gray stretch, and you suddenly see how far you can actually see. I thought about the wedding. About the moment of stillness at the altar when everything I had believed about the previous 3 years simply resorted itself, like a deck of cards snapping back into order. I thought about the coat check chair, and the cab, and the cracked window on Eglinton. I did not feel grateful to Oliver for what he had done. That would be too simple, and also not accurate. What he had done was cruel, and I was allowed to name it that, and not dress it up in retrospective gratitude. But I could also see, with the particular clarity that comes from a few months of distance and work, that the version of my life I had been building with him was smaller than I had known how to see at the time. Not because of what he earned or where he lived, because of who he had turned out to be. January arrived cold, the way January in Toronto always does, with the specific bleakness of a city that knows exactly what it signed up for. I had been back from Edmonton for 3 months and had found a rhythm. It was Tara who told me, without meaning to cause drama, that Oliver's firm was in trouble. The project they had been counting on, a large commercial development contract with a municipal government in the GTA, had fallen through after a competitive review. The contract had represented about 30% of the firm's projected revenue for the year. There were, according to Tara, who had heard from the mutual friend, conversations about layoffs. I already knew this, not because I had been watching Oliver's firm, but because the development project in question had been reviewed by one of our portfolio advisors as a potential investment 18 months ago, and we had passed on it after due diligence raised concerns about the municipal timeline. The concerns had been correct. There is no satisfaction in that, exactly. There is something, but it isn't satisfaction. In February, Oliver's firm issued a public statement restructuring about strategic restructuring. Cassandra, according to LinkedIn, was still employed there. Oliver's title was unchanged. But I knew, from things I had read between the lines of things I hadn't gone looking for, that they were in the particular kind of difficulty that looks manageable from the outside and is much less manageable from the inside. I had made no moves against them. None. I want to be clear about that. My family's company had no active position in anything related to Oliver's firm, and I had specifically noted this to Walter when the restructuring news became public, to ensure there was no conflict or appearance of one. I was not interested in revenge. I was interested in building something. But I'm also not going to pretend that I felt nothing when I read the headline. I was in the middle of a reorganization of our communications strategy. A formal announcement was being drafted, the language being carefully calibrated by our legal team and our PR firm, about my upcoming role as trustee. The announcement would go to business press and financial press simultaneously, timed for early April, about 3 weeks before my birthday. The week before it ran, I got an email from Oliver. It was professional in tone. He had heard, he said, through the industry grapevine, that I was taking on a more formal role in a family investment portfolio, and he wanted to say congratulations. And also, and this was the part I read twice, if there were ever opportunities where his firm's engineering and project management expertise might be relevant to any infrastructure work we were considering, he would welcome the conversation. I read it in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, over coffee, and I sat with it for a long time. Then I forwarded it to Walter with a 2-word note, no response. The announcement ran on a Thursday morning. The Globe and Mail ran a short item in their report on business. The Financial Post ran a longer profile, timed to coincide, that my PR firm had been preparing for 2 months. It described the history of Sterling North Capital, my grandfather's founding of the company, my father's expansion of it, and then my own background, my academic record, my communications career, my advisory work over the past several months, and my upcoming formal role as trustee and chair of the board. My phone was very busy that Thursday. The email from Oliver arrived at 3:47 in the afternoon. It was short. It said he hadn't realized the full scope of what I was stepping into, that he had always respected my ambition, and that he hoped things were good. I closed the email and put my phone in my bag and went back to work. I don't know exactly when it became clear to him, when the full picture assembled itself in his mind. Maybe it was the Thursday of the announcement. Maybe it was earlier, at the AGO gala, when he had watched me stand in a room where people spoke to my father the way people speak to someone who controls the terms of the conversation. Maybe it was even earlier, some ordinary moment during the 3 years we had been together, something I said or didn't say that, retroactively, had a different shape. I thought about that sometimes, in the months that followed. Not obsessively, but the way you occasionally press a bruise to check whether it still hurts. It hurt less and less. Tara told me, in March, that Oliver and Cassandra had broken up. I said, oh, and asked how her sister's new baby was doing, and we moved on. My 35th birthday was a Saturday in late April. My father flew in from Edmonton. We had lunch at a restaurant near the lake with Walter and a few of the board members. And in the afternoon, in a lawyer's office in the financial district, I signed the papers. There was no ceremony to it, particularly. It was paperwork, witnessed and notarized. But I felt it, the specific weight of it, the way you feel the shift in a room when something has been settled. I went home and called my mother, who had passed away 7 years earlier, in a way that I will not use this story to describe because she deserves more than a sentence. I didn't call her, obviously. I sat in my kitchen, and I talked to her anyway, the way I do sometimes when something happens that she should have seen. I told her I was okay, that I was more than okay, that I had made it through the version of the story where the worst thing that could have happened turned out to be the thing that clarified everything else. The wedding dress is in a garment bag in my storage unit. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. I could donate it. I probably will. It was expensive, and it's beautiful, and it deserves to be worn by someone for whom it will mean what I had hoped it would mean, on a day that ends better than mine did. The memory I come back to, when I think about that day, is not Oliver at the altar or Cassandra's heels on the marble or the murmuring crowd. It is the coat check chair, and the strange quiet of the corridor, and the moment I decided to breathe and then to move, and not to let any of them see what they had done. They had made a calculation about who I was, and what I was worth, and what it would cost them to make a different choice. They had been wrong about all three.